So hi, everyone. This is my final project / presentation, quirkily titled What It Takes to Curate, the Importance of Representation in Archives. This project reflects both my work throughout my internship and my final project. My project is kind of like a I guess I take you with me on my experiences, my challenges, my final conclusions. It's all kind of tied up in the significance and looking at, obviously, the importance of representation of archives. So we're gonna get into the legacy of archives. So what is an archive? Concerns with the archive, highlighting issues with archival institutions, decolonizing archives, and issues with perspective. We're going to look a bit closer at works by Zoe Todd, Crystal Fraser, and Krista McCracken, and then the final results, so my timelines, and public history and project significance. So before, in case we all kind of forget over the last few months, I was partnered with OurDigitalWorld, their nonprofit organization that digitizes archives and primary sources for libraries, museums, cultural heritage sites, etc. They sell different softwares to help these institutions put their information online and more accessible to the public. One of these functions that they were really focused on and wanted to have me a part of were their multicultural exhibits. So these exhibits were all pretty neat, like ways to engage with different histories, the main ones being Ontario Black history, Ontario women's history, and Ontario Japanese history. My job was to make timelines out of these exhibits. So a lot of my primary sources in my research came from Our Ontario, which was our, as they describe it, a one-stop search portal for multiple heritage organization collections. So these are uploaded through their customizable VITA platform for digital heritage collections. It's kind of like when you go into the UT library catalog searching. This is their version of that. So it's a bit different. That's what I primarily worked with. So not to say that my sources were limited, but my sources were they certainly had to stay within Ontario, and this was a really good tool to pull from. So that's where most of my research focused from. So let's get into the legacy of the archive. To start off with kind of understanding and contextualizing works with archives and primary sources, I found inspiration from David Lowenthal's work. So he discusses their legacy, specifically its perceived objectiveness and issues with it, and kind of an ongoing thing that I've, I guess, learned throughout my degree is that history is not as objective as just your textbooks might tell you to be. We've all kind of realized that throughout our internships, and so he really brings that to the forefront of his work. So he brings up the Western world specific obsessive concern with material evidence of the past, further explaining how material evidence has been used to dictate the lives of citizens and institutions for hundreds of years. So it really is this deeply ingrained kind of institution within the work that we do. And it was also used among the wisest of populations, circled only amongst themselves, to be used more to shackle than to liberate inquiry. And this is a very, I guess, historical look at the big bad archive. It kind of does paint that picture. There are a lot of new uses for it. It obviously has different significance today. And that was actually drawn out, or I guess connects to my first impression of the archive. So with all of this context that I provided within my actual project, I wanted to talk about my first impressions of archives just in general. It's obviously, there are visible pros to them. They provide insight into the past and historical context for events. They're a really good reference for legal proceedings, family histories, laws and policies, but there are a lot of visible cons. And when I think of the cons, I think of Robarts, and I think of how they're kind of under lock and key there. They're really hard to kind of get access to, and I'll get into that with some more scholars that I talk to or engage with. And they're kind of confusing, they're intimidating. And it's not, I thought it was just me, I thought it was my kind of inexperience, and then the more that I looked at it, I noticed that that wasn't the case, and that David Lowenthal's kind of discussion is still relevant today in the fact that it does affect how people interact with archives. So Jack Jedwab kind of has this article that was really informative on just how Canadians kind of think about archives, or students in general. And I had to think about this when I was creating my timelines, because I wanted to know kind of how, if this was someone's first experience with archives, what were they going to think about it? Were they as inexperienced as myself? Did I have to kind of do a little bit more work to help contextualize that for them? So 28% of Canadians surveyed say they knew of the LAC, and of that 28%, 75 said they never used their services before. And I was absolutely a part of that 75%. It's really hard to kind of navigate their website. It's usually, or it's been under construction for a little while. So yeah, before this internship, I didn't have much of an idea about it. Most of their services are hard to access. You need applications to actually look at a lot of the archives that they have locked up. And they compete with other online sources for information. So as much as they're significant, you're also competing with like Wikipedia, different books and sources. A lot of people can conjure up facts and truth nowadays. So obviously, if you're someone that's not aware of these archives that exist, you're gonna get your information elsewhere. And that's not really anyone's fault. So with this information in mind, I kind of had to understand this and make the timeline as easy to understand as possible. A good way to make this happen was the ODW software actually allows you to insert little links that kind of go back to exhibits themselves. I'm not totally great at understanding this, but basically, if you were to look through my timeline and you thought that that source was interesting, it was pretty cool, you could click on it and it would take you back to the exhibit, and then that exhibit also takes you back to its actual origin. So whether it's from the Six Nations Public Library or some other heritage site, it does a really good job of always providing that context where if you were to go somewhere else, you might not know where that's from, how else to connect with it, what other sources are like it. So I thought that that was really helpful. It gives viewers the chance to engage with sources similar to each other, kind of understand where they're coming from. So concerns with the archive. This is also tied to how my project speaks to some issues in public history. So Cheryl Thompson, professor at Ryerson, I believe, has a really good quote that I pulled where prowling the archives takes on new significance when you approach it as a contested space and as situated knowledge that reflects a point of view rather than as a repository of neutral, unbiased artifacts from the past. It's a really good quote that sums up how I kind of had to change my thinking about the images that I was presenting. So one of the questions I asked myself while making this is, how should I present these? Like, should I continue to present them as objective truths about women's history or Ontario Black history? Or should I be a little more nuanced with how I engage with my sources? Should I be honest and open with the viewer about how this is not always how history is, or this history doesn't include a lot of perspectives that are missing, so on and so forth. And that's something that I had to get across through the timeline. So one way that I did that, this is just the closing panel of one of the women's timelines. And so you can't see it as well, but I have some kind of critical thinking questions that I left at the end. And those read, for example, like, is this settler history representative of all women's history in Ontario? What women were excluded and who was excluded from these advances? What images stand out to you and why? So these kind of questions that I've posed and other information, sorry, oh my gosh, I'm running out of breath. I don't think I've ever talked this long. So, and that's totally a lie. So these are just some of the questions that I wanted to pose just to keep the reader kind of, like one-to-one. This isn't objective. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And I want them to keep in mind, because that wasn't something that I ever found in other curated works. I'm not totally familiar with them, but let's say at a museum or a gallery, I'm like a big museum fan. And as I kind of went through my degree, I had a lot more questions and wished that exhibits asked more questions and were more honest, because I think that one of the problems within public history is the need to seem like so perfect, and that like this exhibit is so fantastic, but it doesn't always have to be. And history isn't always like that, and it can just be a reflection of experiences instead of objective truth, and that's what I was trying to get across in some of these slides. So a bigger, kind of greater issue embedded within archives that's kind of been popular for, or got a lot more attention in like recent years, is decolonizing archives and issues with perspective. So this section hopefully will convey what my sources tell us about the past and how contemporary concerns and issues impact my approach to my source material as well. Okay, so fun fact about these two authors. I had a 300 level class, maybe in my second or third year, and one of my professors, one of the requirements was one of their readings. And there's this one quote that I've had from them, like on my sticky board of just like things that I think are really interesting. And I just wrote down archives as institutions, and thank goodness I wrote the authors, or else I wouldn't have been able to trace that at all. And that was a part of this larger idea and a part of decolonizing archives. So what their work does is offer insight into the deep connections that archives have to colonialism. So Todd herself even discusses her experience with retrieving information from Library and Archives Canada. It actually took her about a year, and then she got a response saying that someone was using it and then they didn't know when it was going to be returned or something like that. And it was for, like, they're obviously academics, so it was for like an actual paper or like part of research, and so they weren't really allowed to get that. And this just does a great job of talking about how institutions and documents uphold colonial practices by keeping information from people, certain kinds of information. Obviously, documentation practices are very contested and only include maybe written sources from Western countries and whatnot, and they don't recognize a lot of other perspectives. So that was Fraser and Todd. And Krista McCracken, like Todd and Fraser, looks at issues with the LAC specifically, so it's Library and Archives Canada, in relation to residential school history. So McCracken defines archives as being directly connected to what and whose stories are remembered, accessed, and told. She discusses the quality of archives relating to residential schools, primarily from the perspective of residential school staff, with a lack of information from the student perspective. So what Krista McCracken's work does is kind of goes a bit deeper into what Todd and Fraser were referring to, where she's actually looking at the quality of the archives and who they're actually like taken from. So For example, and I might come back to this, but when I was doing my Ontario Japanese history timeline, I focused mainly on internment. And all of the images that I've been coming across, obviously, whether they're photographs or maps or something different, even just after reading that article by her, I realized that like none of these are actually, or very few of them are taken by like Japanese Canadian men or by women themselves. Like they're usually taken at the hands of like settlers. So their history is always going to be told, like regardless of the images. Obviously they provide us a lot of context into events, but it is from a settler perspective. So all of the archives I'm engaging with are also from settler perspective. And that's something that really helped create questions within my timelines and make it a little more apparent to the reader. One of these examples is this image in particular. Me and my supervisor were looking over it, and if you can see the names, so it has like the description and it's names of like each of the men in the photo. Some of those names my supervisor mentioned like are probably not their actual names. And this is part of identity erasure within history and archives. So that was something that sometimes when I saw something like that, I was so frustrated. And I was like, how am I going to make the history of Ontario internment if I can't even find real information about the people that it was about? And then I had to kind of rewire that and be like, okay, Victoria, we're not necessarily going to focus on their names, but make it clear that their experiences in this image, at least, are taken from a settler perspective, or their names are being changed because of documentation practices by settler colonialism, and so on and so forth. So my final results, timelines in public history. I'll answer this big question of in what sense is the public better served by the research you have conducted? These are my timelines, all of them. I'm pretty proud of them. They're like my babies in a way, and Jess did a really good job. I've never had someone, I guess, older than me or a different level of skill than me edit my work like that, and she really polished them off. I was like, wow, this is great, but I'll take all the credit. So thankfully, they turned out really lovely. But this big question of like, in what sense is the public better served by my work? I think that these timelines in themselves are a really good way to, like, maybe for someone starting out, I'm not talking about like museum curators, they know a lot more than me, but for people like, let's say like us or myself, looking at archives, to know that it's not objective and that obviously there's a lot of voices being excluded from the picture. And it's always important to listen to academics who say this. So throughout this, I wouldn't have been able to kind of come up with my ideas if it wasn't for the research and the academics that I consulted along the way. And I hope that obviously a lot of the academics that I put into my project maybe don't act as like a guide for someone that needs to know what it takes to curate. But maybe those are good references for someone that is new to archives and what they are and their legacy and whatnot. And obviously my images and the sources that I brought to these timelines, I think speak a good deal to some of these specific histories. So I tried to specify them. For example, because of the limited sources, women's history turned into the progression of settler women's roles in Ontario from 1800s to 1960s. So obviously that's very specified. It's not as general. And there are some really good bits of information that shows the evolution of roles. For Japanese internment in Ontario, growing up, I didn't know much about Japanese internment specifically in Ontario. They don't really teach us that much in school, depending on where you go to. And maybe now it's a lot different, but if someone can learn that there were camps in Ontario and some of the significant leaders and people that talked about it that are Japanese Ontarians, then that's fantastic. And I'm really, I was really shocked to know that this is just like accessible to the public and someone can just like stumble across them for maybe like a project or something. I thought that that was really interesting.